Thank you so much to to Anjali for that wonderful introduction, to my co-panelists, to the audience here for waiting patiently. As Anjali said, we at Article 14 put forward this study on sedition called The Story of Sedition in India over 10 years, technically 12, which we call A Decade of Darkness. And, before I get into the findings of the study, why did we do this work is also important. So why did we put out this sort of study over 12 years? And the sort of trigger for it was the anti-CA protests that happened in 2019 and 20 across India. And of course, in the time preceding that, which is since 2014, there has been a decline in speech and expression, as well as the force of the law, the violence of the law on people who want to say things about the government. And so, but the anti-CA was sort of I would say, the final trigger for us to really think about how this law is being used, where is it being used, and who is it being used against, why is it being used? Because we felt that there are bigger social, political, and legal complexities that are all coming together in sedition. And so we needed to sort of show how it has evolved over time. And actually my co-panelists, two of whom have, in geographically very different parts of the country, Tamil Nadu and Jharkhand, actually are representative of that story, which is the changing nature of sedition over governments over time, as well as representative of the fact that there are some very deep political fault lines and very deep struggles in this country, of which sedition is a sort of, you could say, a manifestation of that. Because what both panelists did was actually describe that entire political backstory, which is so important in the context of sedition, which is why the case was filed against them. So to sort of understand that legal response, or the depth of that legal response, which is the use of sedition, is why we wanted to document it. And so what we found since 2010 was certainly that while the decade began with all of those sedition cases filed against thousands of people in Kudankulam, the decade sort of ended, which is 2020 or 2021, ended with, for example, the CA protests, the Hathras protests in UP. And in the middle, we also saw cases filed against the Jat agitation, the Patitar agitation, of course, the Pathalgadi movement. And so, the decade was sort of marked by all of these protests by groups across the country, geographically diverse, linguistically and diverse on religion and caste. Of course, the point of the story is also that the meaning of sedition, as someone mentioned earlier, the meaning of sedition also evolves with who is in power, and what they believe should be loyalty towards them. And so while under the UPA 2, you saw a particular kind of loyalty, we sort of documented cases being filed against people who protest development, economic development projects, or even left-wing extremism. And so a lot of cases that we saw were in Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and of course, Tamil Nadu. That changed after 2014. And then a very different type of seditious person started to emerge after 2014 under this government. And that only got louder and louder again after 2019, after the BJP won again. And so what we saw after 2014 was, of course, the rise of the, the conflation, I would say, of also religion and nationalism. So to be anti-India today is also to be anti-Hindu. And so both of these things are also seditious today. So, this is sort of, I would say, how the decade was broken up. But another very important discovery from our work, and that also forced us to think about, these new kinds of sedition cases and what we started to call the category of the everyday, Because what we have discussed until now, or what seems to be in the imagination of the public of who is seditious, is yes, very often the protester, the critic, the outspoken voice against the government. But what we found is that there are a lot of people who do not fall under this bracket of criticism, protesting, or anything of the kind. In fact, they are very often young Muslim boys in the age group of, say, 17 to maybe 30, who use social media and who happen to post around certain quote unquote sensitive times and then find themselves immediately arrested by the police. It's not only social media users, of course, that is one category of cases, but the other kinds of cases we found that we call the everyday case, which is ordinary people doing ordinary things that are today considered seditious. Under this category, there are also people who, in one case, a group of boys in Bihar who were dancing to a song whose lyrics were apparently objectionable. In another case we found in Karnataka, a sedition charge was filed in the context of a marital dispute between, where the husband filed a case of sedition against the wife and her family. The FIR does not mention at all why sedition was filed. So, this is the sort of every day, there is no criticism, there is no protest, there is no sort of outspoken voice against the state, and yet this is being done. In another case, the trigger for the case was actually a loud bike silencer in a case in UP. And so the complainant in the case was offended by this bike silencer that disturbed him in the afternoon, and ended up filing, and that sort of triggered into some kind of conflict between two groups, and a sedition case was filed. And so this kind of complexity, of course, in sedition is what we discovered. And to sort of come back to the social media, and we, some of our panelists have referred to that, when something is posted on social media, it then travels into the hands of the police. And this is also a very important journey for us to understand, particularly around the Pulwama time in Feb 2019. In Karnataka, UP, and Assam, there was already that kind of cybercrime surveillance by the police on what people are posting. And in all three states, we documented several rural social media users who come from, low socioeconomic backgrounds, who happen to like a picture or post a picture or change their WhatsApp display picture or post something on Facebook, thinking that they are supporting the Indian government, and it happened to be supporting, Pakistan. Now, these kinds of things, and when we interviewed them on the field, many of them, of course, said, we didn't know what we were posting. We didn't know that this is, seditious. Or that, the moment we posted it, 5 minutes later, the police came and arrested me, or 30 minutes later, the police came and arrested me. And I think the other thing that we learned from our interviews is the speed with which the police has filed these FIRs, gone to the person's house and picked them up for that post, which also then got us thinking about how these social media posts travel in those hyper-local settings, in those villages and districts where everyone is on a WhatsApp group, where anyone can take a screenshot of what you have posted and send it to the local police thana on their WhatsApp number. And this is sort of the new, I would say, very dangerous pattern we've seen emerging out of the use of social media, not just the use of social media, but how that tweet or that post or that WhatsApp message reaches the hands of the police. And this brings me to sort of my, another finding for us, which is that since 2014, the rise of the nationalist complainant, it's no longer just the police who are filing the FIRs, but there are actively public right-wing voices who proudly sort of say that they are going to file a sedition FIR against, for example, a 36-year-old electrician, a 23-year-old waiter in Assam, a shepherd in Karnataka who studied up to 3rd standard, who did not know, who couldn't read and write Kannada on his phone, thought he was posting something and had no idea what he posted. Again, this is not to sort of say that this is in fact seditious or these posts are seditious in any way, but it is just the sort of, and to look at the background of, why a complainant would even want to do this is because there is a certain political climate. So of course, all of this is in the backdrop of that political climate, conversations about, not engaging with Pakistan as a country, or that anything about, saying anything about them in public would be considered seditious. So what we discovered from the everydayness category, which is none of these people had criticized, protested, spoken out against the government, said anything about policy, and yet were considered, seditious. And what that also, what that tells us is certainly that the net or the understanding of sedition now is sort of defies any legal logic. It defies any sort of, constitutional considerations. It's a very, very, we already know that the language of the law is vague. We already know 124A, the way it's worded, is vague, which is why the guidelines were set in place, which is why Kedarnath Singh came in, which is why in the law itself, there is an exception that criticism is not sedition. But what about all of these cases that fall outside of that? People who don't know what they are posting, or, and why should that post, of course, be considered seditious? I mean, that's a question, that's a general sort of question about all of this. But, so I think what I think what makes it very hard to have that conversation also about guidelines to regulate the use of sedition. Something that our research told us was exactly this, that ultimately, it's not just the fact that the police have filed the FIR in that particular village. It is also how they were pressurized into doing so. When you have, right-wing groups protesting that an FIR must be filed, or when you have someone from that group sitting in the police station and dictating the charges to be filed in the FIR, which happened in a case in UP, it's, how do you expect guidelines to regulate that, especially when, we understand that there is a political climate created. For example, around cricket, and in 3 separate instances, in 2014, 17, and 2021, the latest being the T20 match between India and Pakistan. Before that was the ICC Champions Trophy in 2017. In all of these instances, 3 separate instances since 2014, India lost to Pakistan. And, inevitably, sedition cases were filed. I mean, I say inevitable because, this is the sort of climate we're in. But, in all 3 sort of instances, sedition cases were filed against people who were apparently supporting Pakistan's win against India. In both those instances, in 2017 and 2021, there were Kashmiri students who apparently supported this. And in both those instances, the sort of how the legal process played out was quite similar, in the sense that both were boycotted by local bar associations in Karnataka and in UP. Local lawyers refused to represent them. They were mobbed when they went to the district courts. Bail was denied several times by the trial court. So, so this is again, the idea that the legal process is the punishment. This is how the legal process is the punishment in sedition cases, as my co-panelists also pointed out, which is, it is not just the fact that the case is filed against you. It is also what happens after the case is filed against you. And particularly in these cases, when, it's a question of, India versus Pakistan, that sort of makes it even harder to even get a lawyer to represent you, because nobody wants to represent you. And then to find somebody who represents you, you have to pay them. And then, of course, every hearing, there's an expense to that. Not only that, when you finally get bail, and in fact, in the case in 2021, where 3 students were arrested after sort of allegedly supporting Pakistan's win, They were boycotted by the Agra Bar Association. Their bail hearings were, it took about 7 or 8 hearings before the district court for them to get bail. They were in jail for a month even after getting bail because they did not have the resources to pay bail bond. And so, the families again, and we heard this before from our other panelists, had to sell their land or, sell other assets just to be able to pay bail bonds. Now, of course, it doesn't end here. So they may have to keep reporting to the local police station. The local police will keep surveilling them. It's not going to end. And of course, this comes in the backdrop of the Chief Minister of UP saying, explicitly making a statement that anybody found supporting Pakistan will be arrested under sedition. This is the Chief Minister of a state in India saying that. So, to then sort of in this context, therefore, in this kind of loaded political context, to even have a conversation on narrowing the use of sedition, or even something like the misuse of sedition, which is also an interesting word, because to me, it presumes that there is a way to use sedition in the right way, that, if sedition were narrowed down, then this is the right way to use sedition. But it's not possible. It's not possible to use this law in the right way. These are not just, and this was also an argument put forth by the Solicitor General. I mean, there was there were arguments before court being made about the misuse of sedition. It can be guided. The police can be told how to use it. It's not possible. You cannot. It's impossible. The mix of the local politics, the mix of police power, the mix of when the Chief Minister of UP makes a statement like that, which police officer can say, no, we are not going to file a sedition case because it does not follow the Kedarnath Singh guidelines or other guidelines. So when you sort of look at the research, not just of course the empirical or the data, the numbers of how many cases are filed against how many people and in what context they're filed, but also what are the realities of what happens after the FIR is filed. Even after you are granted bail, there are so many things you have to do. So for example, we spoke to a daily wage laborer in Karnataka who said because he's a daily wage laborer, he'll miss out on every time he has to go to the district court, which again is, hundreds of kilometers away from his village. Each hearing, he loses a day's wages. Each hearing, he'll have to pay that much money to go there. And so, this kind of, and ultimately, given the rates of acquittal and conviction, I mean, considering you may have only 10 people convicted out of, 10,000. So what is really happening then? And I'm not making an argument here that, we must have convictions in sedition, but the fact that if you have more acquittals than convictions, clearly your evidence is not strong. Your prosecution is not able to make that case. And how could they? How could a t-shirt be seditious? How could dancing to a song be seditious? How could, supporting another team in a cricket match be seditious? So what kind of, case are you then building up before court? What kind of case is the government building up? Of course, it's going to lead to an acquittal. I mean, this cannot fall under any reasonable judge would say this is not incitement to violence. No violence was incited by wearing this t-shirt. So, I think to sort of sum up all of this, I mean, from just the combination of the fact that the speed with which the executive moves when it has to, combined with the slowness of the court and the legal process. So together it creates this kind of very, very difficult, ultimately, and difficult is an understatement, but difficult situation for the accused, who may eventually have a higher chance of getting acquitted 10 years later, if they are lucky. And of course, in those 10 years, you're paying an economic cost and a social cost, which is also so important, and which Mr. Udayakumar mentioned, which is that stigma of that tag of, being a Deshdroh and a Rajdroh, because of which you can lose your job, you will lose your family, you may be ostracized, you will have to move villages, which happened to people that we interviewed. Somebody had to move out of where they were because of that tag. So, all of this sort of put together, I would say, it really is the story of sedition in India, which is, it is no longer actually just people who are outspoken and who are critics. It could really be anybody for anything. And that is what is so scary about where we are right now.